Welcome, I'm Andy Goulton. I'm Commercial Partnership Manager here at the Building Centre. For those not familiar, Retrofit 25 is the Building Centre's third Retrofit exhibition programme and the first in collaboration with our partners, the National Retrofit Hub, where we join forces to tackle the main question, what's stopping us? Ignore that for the moment, listen to me please. We're very fortunate and privileged to be joined by Mete. However, he's a man whose time is in demand, so we have not as long as we would like. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure in welcoming Mete Coban MBE, Deputy Mayor of London for Environment and Energy, to share his views on hearts and minds within the context of retrofit.
You know, like when I think about the actual, the title about hearts and minds, it's such a timely conversation that we're having right now, right? Like, you know, you look around what's happening around the world, and unfortunately, we have a climate denier who's in charge of the most powerful country in the world. And there is this huge attack on climate action. And of course, you know, not to politicize this as well, but also we see here in the UK as well with, you know, the rise of the far right and Reform, who've now taken this big attack on net zero. Politicize something that should never have been politicized and will be the biggest betrayal of future generations if we don't take climate action. So I think it's really important that we are talking about hearts and minds, because actually I think the retrofit agenda is one of the key ways where we can actually deliver tangible benefits to Londoners and our residents. But firstly, I do want to say thank you to the National Retrofit Hub and the Building Centre for putting on this fantastic event. So let's give them a massive round of applause. To be totally blunt with you all, gonna be honest, I don't come from background. My parents are asylum seekers. I came here when I was 2 from Cyprus, and I ended up in a place called Hackney, very trendy and hipster place to live now, but it wasn't the most or trendy place to live. In fact, you not have wanted to live in Hackney when I was growing up. And one of the reasons why this topic around the climate agenda is really something that really sort of I'm passionate about is partly because, you know, I'm from a community who's probably done the least to cause the air pollution, but also the climate crisis that we face today, but actually is disproportionately more impacted by the climate crisis. And every time I remember going home as a kid, you see your parents opening their energy bills and they see rising energy prices because we're dependent on fossil fuels. And every time something happens around the world, who's paying the price for it? It's working class Londoners. Or the fact that we have really bad air quality. When you're a young child and your lungs are stunted, you will never be able to fulfill, you know, the full potential of your lungs and to be able to breathe clean air. You wouldn't drink dirty water, so why do we tolerate breathing dirty air? And so for me, I grew to care about this issue because the issue of tackling the climate crisis is very much an issue of tackling social inequality, and it's an issue of delivering social justice, it's an issue of delivering racial justice, but it's also an issue of delivering economic justice for Londoners. And so for me, you know, and the mayor, and I'm very proud to be working for the Mayor of London City Khan, who's put environmental action really at the heart of his mission to deliver climate action, because we very much sort of see this as our mission to really deliver a fairer London. And the retrofit agenda for us is such an important area of work. I used to be a Hackney councillor. I was first elected at the age of 12. I wasn't really. I was 21 when I was elected as a Hackney councillor, and I served as a Hackney councillor for 10 years. And the borough that I grew up in. And in Hackney, I used to be the cabinet member for the environment and transport. And one of the things that when I used to remember in Hackney, I remember we have this really odd and bizarre system in London where most boroughs, right, if you think they control their housing stock, they have to bid to government to get money to basically deliver a retrofit across the borough and the housing stock, or if they want to do something with the private homes as well. The problem with that is two things. The first is it creates bidding wars between all the councils, so there ain't no strategic approach to retrofit across the city. The second problem is, in the last 14 years, most boroughs have been so stripped for cash that a lot of councils, and also added with the complexity of the fact that most councils' housing services are under real pressure, both from the backlog that took place during the pandemic, but also because of the lack of finance, they have no capacity to even think about what does retrofit or the feasibility of the housing stock looks like in their borough. And so, as part of when I first got my role, the mayor made it very clear to me. He always says to me, the green transition is one of the biggest economic opportunities of the 21st century. And he always talks about how it's a huge opportunity to also redistribute wealth to some of London's most poorest and most vulnerable communities. And he's always made it clear to me as well. He's always said to me, Mete, we've got to make sure that we deliver tangible benefits to Londoners. So it's all great. We're talking about, like green jobs and high quality jobs and this and that or whatever, but actually, how do we actually make it feel real for Londoners, especially in the wider political context where, we do have, unfortunately, so much misinformation, disinformation around the agenda around net zero, whereas actually we know that if we can retrofit at scale and do it right and do it properly, we can actually deal with some of the, the negative impacts of climate change, be it, extreme heat, and what that means for our homes. We can also deal with the damp and mold issues that we have across our properties across London. But also we can actually deliver tangible benefits and making sure that people can feel more money in their pockets so that can actually enjoy with their family and friends. So that's why what we've done since I've taken over as Deputy Mayor of London is we've set up something called the Warmer Homes London. Warmer Homes London essentially aims to deal with the problem that I described to you earlier around how the councils work. So what we're now doing is basically doing, one is we're dealing with the problem of the bidding wars that you have between the councils by leading a consortium bid in the short term. So we're no longer basically saying all different boroughs are applying, and for those boroughs who don't have the capacity to even apply or to even think about the feasibility, we're doing that on behalf of them. And that means that we get much more scale in London in terms of thinking about retrofit and a much more strategic approach. So we've been recently successful in attracting over £232 million of investment through the government's Warmer Homes England programme, which will retrofit up to 22,000 homes in the next 2 years. That is transformational. Not enough for where we need to get to for our net zero ambition, but it's a good first step. And the impact that has, not only on tackling fuel poverty, but also helping support our most vulnerable residents, but it also has a huge impact if you think about the skills training agenda too, because, when you speak to a lot of providers, one of the things they always say to you is like, I went to visit London Stadium, and we basically installed 3,200 solar membranes on the roof of the stadium. And I was talking to Amoresco, who basically were actually installing the solar membranes. And I asked them how many of the people actually working here are like local, and they were like none, because they're just the skills, like the workforce just isn't there. And partly the problem is like because the jobs don't exist for it to an extent, like the scale question isn't there. People ain't putting as much as money in terms of the skills and the training that's needed. So that's partly the aim what we're trying to achieve with Warmer Homes London. In the long term, what we want to do is to see a system where, as part of the integrated settlement that we have with the government, to have 4 to 5 year funding around retrofit, which then allows us to also tackle some of the complexities in terms of London's housing tenure mix as well, recognising some of the complexities, but have a much more strategic approach over 4 to 5 years and be able to make sure that we get more, bang for our buck in terms of what we can actually deliver for London. So Warmer Homes London is a massive opportunity for all of you to really engage in, and that's one of the reasons why I'm very much looking forward to be part of this conversation, because I'm very conscious that sometimes government, regional authorities, local boroughs can do amazing things, but actually are we working with the sector in a way that can actually deliver and unlock the pace of delivery that we need for Londoners. So it's great to be here, to be having this conversation with you. And I think that, if we can get this right, all of the things that I described around, how do we actually win people's hearts and minds, of course, dealing with the climate crisis is really important from the context of thinking about saving our planet. Of course it is. But actually sometimes the extreme doom and gloom can feel quite overburdening for a lot of Londoners. And when you speak to people, it's like, Mete, what can I do? I'm the little man in the room. Go pick on like the big fossil fuel company or whatever it is. And actually, I think we're not just doing this because we have to. We're also doing this fundamentally because the green transition unlocks so many benefits, and the retrofit agenda is one of those areas. And I think we can massively help support people at a time of a cost of living crisis where people are really struggling with their disposable levels of income, being able to sort of like help ease some of that squeeze that they feel in their pockets we can make a real difference. So that's something that both myself and the Mayor is very passionate about. As I say, Warm Homes London is one part of how we're hoping to try to do that, both social housing and also local private homes as well. But actually, what I'm looking for, and one of the things that I keep speaking to my team at the GLA and the Greater London Authority about, is how do we get much more innovative with some of our use of our public buildings, thinking about, like innovative technologies that we can use to really accelerate the scale that we need, what we're doing with our rooftops, for example, across the city. These are all the questions that we should be thinking about. And I think the great thing that we have at the moment, again, not to make this too political, although I've been very political, haven't I? Is for the first time, London, in the last 14 years, isn't a dirty word no more for government. Previously, you had a government who was continuously working, making life difficult, well, not 14 years, but during the Mayor of London's time, the last 9 years, making life difficult for Sadiq Khan. And actually, for the first time, you have a government who actually believes in climate change and who wants to do stuff around it. You've got a Mayor of London who's equally as ambitious, if not more ambitious, on what we can do, particularly around on retrofit and on transport, particularly. But also, you've got councils who are also familiar, like leading amazing sort of examples of what they're doing on this agenda. So you've got this political alignment across three different layers of government, which hasn't existed to the same extent in terms of the strength that it has. And so there's a massive opportunity for us in the next 3 to 4 years to really make real strides in this area. And as I always say to people, us as politicians, we go around and we don't have all the ideas. The best bit about my job is actually meeting people who work across industry and sectors who are doing amazing things in their respective fields. And actually, what I want to do as Deputy Mayor over the next 3 years is make sure that I'm using my platform, my convening power, the support and the levers that I have to be able to really accelerate the amazing work that you're all doing. So I'm very pleased to be here with you all tonight. I am very sorry that I do have to actually leave because I hate going to events where you just say something and then you just leave. Like, I actually really enjoy speaking to people after because I think that's where some of the best conversations happen. But I do hope that we can connect. The team here have my contact details. My email address is literally my first name .surname @london.gov.uk. So if you do have any ideas about what we should be doing from a London policy perspective, but also how we should be speaking to government around on this agenda as well, please do get in touch. But I hope you have a great evening. And for any Arsenal fans like myself, by the way, that's not the reason why I'm leaving. I shouldn't have said that now, innit? Yeah. It is a Champions League semi-final. No, I actually have another event in Google later on. But have a great evening and hope you have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A couple of points just from me there. So almost building on Mete's momentum, Hearts and Minds really is a subject matter focused on challenging perceptions, changing views and promoting an alternative way. Retrofit 25's overarching theme is what's stopping us. The exploration of Hearts and Minds is central to communicating that message. I think you could see from what Mete was saying there, it's a language piece, it's storytelling, it's engaging, and that's the piece that we're trying to sort of put together and solve that puzzle. But there's lots of questions that remain hopefully answered, but are posing and they're probing, such as how can we collectively transform perceptions of housing to essentially prioritise comfort, safety and investment in all homes, regardless of ownership status? What if retrofit became a cultural movement, helping to redefine what we expect from our buildings? Language and education, again, key drivers to enabling retrofit at scale. We need to improve our storytelling, so that storytelling piece again, so that we can articulate what retrofit actually means. So we are tackling environmental challenges, we're driving economic growth, we're improving public health, and we're trying to reduce living costs. So taking cognizance of all these questions, Hearts and Minds therefore becomes a call to action. We're reliant on experts to change the narrative and affect real change, which leads me on to our panellists. So, speakers tonight, we'll start with Leanne Triton, who is the co-founder of Don't Waste Buildings, a UK-based campaign advocating for the adaptive reuse of existing structures to mitigate climate change. DWB aims to influence government policy by promoting clear policies and financial incentives that favour building reuse over demolition, thereby reducing embodied carbon emissions. And we have Tim Bowder-Ridger, who's partner at Conran & Partners. Tim is passionate about creating authentic experiences centred around cultural spirit and personality. He brings a range of knowledge across different sectors, including hospitality, residential and workplace, to design buildings and spaces that reflect holistic contemporary lifestyle needs and desires. He too has a particular interest in the reuse of existing buildings, both from cultural and environmental sustainability perspectives. And we have Nick de Klerk from Purcell. Nick joined Purcell in 2023 as an associate partner, and he has a particular interest in working with existing buildings and improving their performance, efficiency, and sensitively modernising them through refurbishment or adaptive reuse. He believes this is important work in the context of both conserving built heritage and addressing the climate crisis. And finishing, we have Nikhil Scott, who's Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Change for Historic England. Nikhil previously worked in local government, where he developed a keen interest in tackling climate change, and he now brings that passion to Historic England, where his focus is on influencing climate change policy on a national level, ensuring that historic buildings and the wider historic environment have a part to play in the UK's net zero journey. So I shall step away from the mic and invite Leanne to take the stage, please.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I hadn't heard Mete speak before, but I have to say, and it'll become clearer as I go through the presentation, but I've not heard a politician who's so clearly understood the size of the challenge in terms of the built environment. So I felt actually quite inspired by his opening address, and it's such a shame he's not here to hear the rest of it, because he's obviously an ally for us. He also stole a lot of my opening comments, which was terribly rude. But I want to echo, I've been listening, and I'm not political either, but since the council elections last Thursday, the number of times I've heard net stupid zero be used is quite depressing. And this is obviously a very, very clear tactic. Make no mistake, there is a desire to dismantle this move to net zero. And we have to take on that challenge. We can't ignore it. And the fact is that there are a lot of people in the community who feel that it is net stupid zero. And we have a job to take them on the journey and show them why it's of a benefit for them. And I think, you know, our industry has never been particularly great at launching campaigns that speak directly to the end user. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to come together to show what we're about and what we can do for the community. We often spend a lot of time in silos and talking to each other. That's why we're all here today. I think we're probably all in violent agreement with each other. But let's not be scared about going and talking to the people who aren't in agreement and showing what the art of the possible is. So I'm here to represent Don't Waste Buildings on behalf of my co-founder, Richard Nelson, who's over there in the audience, and also Will Hurst, who couldn't be here tonight. So what I'm going to do is just really run through what we're about and what we've been doing, and hopefully that will inspire you. Sorry, I'll just put this down. Inspire you to really open up the conversation in the Q&A rather than me just rattling on. So it was born out of frustration. I think Will Hurst, who is the editor of Architects Journal, or AJ, called me one day, and he's a pioneer in this sector. He's been talking about retrofit for a very, very long time. I can't possibly claim that, but I was running the PR business that I'd set up called Ing Media, and he called me, and he was very frustrated at the just slow pace of change. And so a few of us came together, and Richard came on board, and at that stage he was the chair of the Institute of Directors Property and Built Environment Group, and that's really, really key to this discussion. SMEs right across the country, and that's where our focus is. It's not just London, but right across the country. So obviously, I'm not going to go through too much about all this stuff about embodied carbon. You're pretty much experts on this, but essentially, embodied carbon from the built environment industry produces more than 64 million tonnes of CO2. It's more than aviation and shipping combined. And what we feel is that policy clarity and regulation is absolutely needed and also supported by the whole industry. We have set out to amplify the industry's common voice and to show that we're singing from the same hymn sheet. So there are a lot of cheesy phrases when you come to a Don't Waste Buildings meeting, but that's how we kind of roll. So we had a small group and we had a meeting, and then we had another meeting, and people kept bringing their friends, and the meetings kept going, and there's a list there. You can't see them all, but we use this presentation quite often, so it's been recycled, but that's because we're a volunteer group and we run on no money, but just huge amounts of energy, and we're constantly managing many things. But the fact that we had so many people coming on board made us realise we were on to something. As I said before, we're non-political, we're volunteers. There's about 150 people in our core group who volunteer and help us out from time to time, and you're all welcome to join that. We sort of went live, because we have no money, our only route to market. We've got a LinkedIn group, that's how we started, which is incredibly uncool, according to my son. But anyway, there are 1,700 people who've joined us, and we don't do any spamming or going out and asking. These are all people who've come to us organically, and we're very proud of that. And we believe our greatest strength is we really do represent people from right across the industry: architects, property developers, investors, heritage experts, you can read them all, but really the whole breadth. And we were really struggling with, when we first started meeting, about this is such a big issue, isn't it? There's embodied carbon, there's the operational carbon, and where do we focus? And we decided to focus on embodied carbon and really make the case for the productive reuse of existing buildings. I'm sure you all know this, but we have to go through this process of explaining to people, and I don't mean this in a patronising way because it had to be explained to me, the differences between embodied carbon and operational carbon. And it's quite simple. This is sort of the walls and the embodied carbon, and the operational is how much it costs to run the building. Again, the facts are clear. 2/3 of waste produced in the UK comes from construction and demolition, and we produce huge amounts of carbon emissions. I think what we're asking for, and what the sort of aim and what we're all headed towards, is the fundamental reshift in the way our whole industry works. And for me personally, I think this is the most exciting part of the whole project, because there have been moments in our history where particularly, and I'm Australian by the way, but I'm now a British citizen, and I'm incredibly proud of the role that Britain has played through many revolutions in leading the world. And there is an opportunity for us to show this leadership once again. And so there's a massive reshift in how we have been doing business to where we need to get to, and that's going to take time, but we do have to bring people along on that journey. Why we must act? Well, we know it's an emergency, but not only that. I mean, it was interesting what Mete said earlier about he grew up in a family that weren't necessarily, climate activists, and I would put myself in the same camp. And in fact, every time I speak to my dad every Sunday morning from Australia, and he always says, "You're architects." They're never his architects, and your greenies. That's always the conversation. And what we've got to make everyone feel is that all of the greenies, we're all greenies because we're all heading to something new. So we need to transition for the future. And the one thing I didn't realise until I got involved with Don't Waste Buildings, because we'd heard about net zero by 2050. What I'd failed to realise was that this was an act of Parliament. You know, this is enshrined in law. I don't know what happens if we don't get there in terms of law, but it is an act of Parliament. And also, surprisingly, and I don't know that people like being reminded of this, this was brought in by Theresa May's government. So this is not Ed Miliband's fault. There's a joke. There we go. And so what our ask is that we want the UK government to introduce policy clarity and financial incentives to make the reuse of existing buildings simpler and more profitable, because that is fundamental. There are lots of great examples of people doing the right thing on reuse of buildings. But if we want it at scale, it needs to be very, very simple, and there needs to be financial incentives so that it's easy for someone in Kettering or Glasgow or London to do the same thing. It shouldn't all be about only the rich being able to reuse a building. But the point that Mete made, and that we make all the time as well, is that there are multiple benefits from doing this. And we talk about climate, but there are many, many other benefits. Meeting housing targets, we're talking about 1.5 million homes that are needed. Now, we don't have to build them all from scratch. There are plenty of houses, and I know we'll be hearing about that later on, but there are plenty of houses that can be reused and quickly. It improves health, it improves biodiversity, we can reskill the workforce, we can provide green jobs, or just jobs if that's all you want, stimulate innovation, grow the green economy, and have massive social impact. And just in terms of what we were talking about earlier with the language, one of the key things with Don't Waste Buildings, when we first met, I think we had a really pithy title like the Circular Economies Buildings, Exploration Group or something like that, which no one understood. But everyone understands waste. So we all understand that when you go to the supermarket, you take your shopping bag, and not one person in the country argues against that now. That has been the most successful transformation of people's behaviour, and everyone does it willingly. Now, if you stop anyone at any supermarket and say, you've got your bag, you're doing the right thing, but around the corner, they're knocking down a building and rebuilding, how many shopping bags is that? And importantly, we're not just about historic buildings. We believe that lots of buildings can be reused. We're not saying that all buildings have to be saved, but we need a shift in behaviour so that the automatic response and reflex is that I can save a building and reuse it. Greenest building is the one that already exists. But importantly, and again, echoing some of the negativity about net zero, the pain is real. And Richard and his team at the Institute of and that is that one in 5 IOD members, now these are small businesses, cite a lack of clear business case to invest in net zero measures. Now, you can't make people do it unless they feel that there is a benefit for them. And it's a hard ask if they're not going to make money out of it, or they're not going to be able to sustain their businesses. 66% indicate at least one type of improved support from government would be helpful. SMEs' views, they see it as costly, and it's being forced upon them. And also, I think this bottom quote is really important. We are a very small business. We try to be as planet-friendly as possible at all times. We care about it, but we're not about to start measuring it. They don't necessarily have those resources to do that sort of thing. So we need to show them that they don't need to measure it. Government can give you the policy the regulation that's absolutely crystal clear and the incentives to make it worth your while. I'm being wound up. Okay, so what's the answer? We think it's good for high streets, good for homes, historic buildings, opportunities for regeneration. I mean, the town centre issue is absolutely in the sweet spot here, and stimulate the green economy. Anyway, I think that's just about, very quickly, what we've been doing and how you can help is I'm going to just quickly move on to this, sorry. I said 10 minutes was going to be too long, but there we go. So we've broken into work streams, which is financial and tax incentives, policies, case studies, engagement, and profile building. We've got a hymn sheet. We've been doing events with the Institute of Directors, bringing all the key figures together. We go right to the MPs. We go right to the politicians. We knock on any door we can, and we'd ask you, if you've got an MP in your area you want us to talk to, we will go and talk to them. We've been doing case study tours, seeing is believing. And we take MPs and councillors on those as well, and they're all free. We'll be going to Portsmouth and Bristol and Hastings coming up, and we do lots of engagement. We've now got chapters in Birmingham, Manchester, Scotland, and Australia. And if you want if you know anyone else who wants to set up a chapter in any other city, know. We've been answering all the consultations, we've been running summits, we've had roundtables, we've been to conferences, and the last very thing is you can see all that stuff, but most importantly is we have a song. We have a children's song, it's called Don't Waste Buildings, it's on all the, iPlayer stuff. If you're posting anything on social media, which is about the reuse of buildings, please use that as a backing track. So just search Don't Waste Buildings, it's on all the platforms. So that's it, thank you very much.
It's the worst part, giving someone a nudge. Right. I can welcome Tim to come up to the stage. That was good. Tim, there you go.
Is it up there?
Should be. Slight lag.
Right. Should we sing that song? Yeah. Oh, here we go. Right. So Tim Badderidge of Conrad and Partners. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on one building, which is just round the corner here, Centre Point. I timed myself earlier. It was 11 minutes, but let's see. Conrad and Partners is founded by Sir Terence Conrad, and I joined him in 1997. He therefore became my great mentor, and carried on working with him right up until his death about 3 years ago. And the thing about Terence is he was not an architect. He wasn't actually a trained designer. What he had is a great intuition of how to connect to people and how to make design accessible. And I think for Retrofit and actually the wider sustainability agenda, that's the key thing, is making it accessible, not preach at people, make it a desirable thing. The other thing about him, he always just go, Tim, I'm a war child, which meant that make, do, and mend. He hated the idea of waste. So his natural propensity was always much more comfortable when we were working with existing buildings and reinventing existing buildings than when we had new build buildings. So this has been a very big influence on me and is a very big influence on our practice. And the founding project for Conrad and Partners was Butler's Wharf, where we were the master planners and architects for about 50% of the building. And Terence got hold of that with a group of investors. At a point, everybody was planning to knock the whole thing down and build little, if you remember the little noddy houses, which were going up in Docklands and a lot of places in the 80s. So he was way ahead of time there. And he just loved the romance of it, and he really went for it. And then I've just shown some examples. We've done quite a lot of retrofit buildings, but I chose some restaurants because you may have gone into them. So a Bluebird down in Chelsea, a Boundary up in Shoreditch, and then German gymnasium up at King's Cross, and they're all about actually engaging with the romance of the buildings. They happen to be very sustainable buildings, but it is offering a bit of joy for what's really important. So I'm going to focus on Centrepoint. And Centrepoint is a very important building for this part of London. It was built in what is now a viewing corridor, but it actually predated the viewing corridor. So it's a very tall building, and along with Post Office Tower, is used as a wayfinder for West London. But the problem was it also acted as a blocker, for Oxford Street into New Oxford Street, and was a rather sad end to Oxford Street. But I'll come on to how we've attempted to address that. So we were the architects and interior designers to try and reinvent the tower. Mica architects, who were Rick Mather architects beforehand, were responsible for and are still responsible for the ongoing works to the lower range buildings and for the public realm. But we work very hand in glove. They're excellent people. It is right in the heart of Theatreland, right in the heart of the cultural district. So a really important site, which most people were proposing to knock it down, even though it's a listed building. So, but it was designed by George Mosh, who was Colonel Seafit's partner. He's kind of been written out of history, but he was the genius behind it, along with Dr. Frischmann, who was the structural engineer, and they came up with this precast way of constructing. And the great thing about the precast is it's all load bearing. All that exoskeleton is load bearing. There's only 4 columns inside the building, and that went up at a rate of 1 floor a week. And you can imagine this in the mid-60s. This was a brave new world when there was a great optimism of trying to address all the bomb damage and clear away the rookeries and, trying to address lots of things. Beautifully made, these precast things. Unfortunately, the inside, it was all in situ cast, and the floors actually vary by 150 mil across them. So a bit of a challenge for us there. So it got completed around 1967 and to great fanfare, and it was designed as an office building. And it was to be the new way of office buildings. It also created a gyratory at street level. So it was very much of its time, which we now see as flawed, where the ground level was given over to King car rather than pedestrians. And that's something which was a big reason why the building had problems. Quite quickly, it became controversial because it was kept empty for whatever investment reasons by Harry Hives. And it was used as a focal point for the housing crisis. So touching on some of the points which have been already raised, having empty buildings is a disaster, not just from a carbon perspective. When Mike Hussey of Alma Cantor took hold of it, he did get it sort of reasonably occupied, but really office use had moved on from there. The floor plate's about 4,000 square feet. You have to use lifts all the way to go up and bottom. But actually what the really big challenges were the floor-to-ceiling heights weren't designed for air conditioning. So people subsequently put full ceilings in. And you can see in that top left image there, the ceiling heights are brought right down by the full ceilings. So you ended up with very dark, gloomy spaces. Some attempts were made to occupy the ground floor. The ground floor was originally designed for car park access. So your entrance point was up a level up. So we were asked to try and reimagine it. How could we make it a better version of itself? And of course, Palazzi described it as the world's first pop art building. So it's this amazing graphic thing, quite groovy in all sense of words, but also in a great location and amazing because nobody can build at all next to it. Amazing views across London, so a massive opportunity. And we quickly established that actually it would make very good residential use. So the building runs north to south, so you get east views, you get west views. The girth of it at its widest point is about 60 metres, which is about the ideal depth for getting daylight into the depth of a floor plan. So turning it over to residential use was the answer. Turning it over to prime residential meant it bankrolled the rest of the development. So MICA's role was to also include affordable housing, and their ongoing role is for refurbishing the existing housing on Centrepoint House, which is next door, the sort of medium height building. One of the first things we did, we looked at the ground floor. So we stripped away the more recent additions and exposed basically what was the car park ramp to 170 car parking spaces down in the basement. There are now 17 car parking spaces for Blue Badge only. So right in the heart there, right next to Tottenham Court Road, why do people need cars? Very controversial at the time amongst Mike's competitors. You know, surely prime people all want to have their Bentleys there. Actually, no. People really like the fact that they're living in the city. So the other challenge we had was that in the original design, you entered as a pedestrian via staircases on the outside, and the ground floor was for the cars to go underneath. But that created quite sort of gloomy entrance spaces, quite difficult spaces to manage, and also the composition was knocked out because the big G's of the Elizabeth line was built closer to the building than one would have hoped, and it took one of the staircases out. So what we did is we repositioned the staircases inside the building. So we managed to retain the balance of the building, the memory of the building, all the treads and the handrails are all the original, and we just had to build a new spine underneath. Only one of those staircases was actually needed functionally, so we got Karis with Wyn Evans to create this sculpture coming down the other staircase, which is directly visible from the outside space. So it's lending that to the public realm, notwithstanding that piece of sculpture wouldn't survive outside. At the top of the building, we took the old tanks out and we put all the water storage and all of that stuff down in the basement in lieu of the cars. And we created, we had to shore it all up, hold it all up, and we created a penthouse at the top there. You'll notice that the signage at the top there on that left-hand image, as you're looking at it, you can see through it. So we wanted to retain the iconography of the external signage, but it was solid. So we changed it by making it, forming it out of mesh, so you could actually see through it. But from street level, it looked like the original signage, albeit with low energy bulbs. Big challenge, the building was leaking heat like nobody's business. We did this thermal image, frankly, you could have seen it from space. So other than retaining all the concrete, we did renew the entire envelope. And that was to do with obviously bringing it up to new energy standards, but also to protect the sound breaking into the apartments. Bearing in mind, Tottenham Court Road is not the quietest place on earth. One of the things we noticed, though, that the windows felt really narrow because they had actually built if you look in that middle image, a high sill there to disguise radiators which had been taken away once people put air conditioning in. So what we wanted to do was actually drop those sills down so you maximise the sense of height, notwithstanding it's a 1960s floor to floor. So at the far side there, those are the original windows, and you can see there's a metal spandrel there. We discovered a watercolour from Seaforth's office in the RBA archive, which actually demonstrated that the intention was for it to be glazed. So we were able to make that argument to the heritage bodies that actually we're restoring it to its original. We kept the window pattern to match the original, albeit you got opening lights there as well. The concrete was in very good condition. We only needed to lightly clean it. But then when it came inside, I mean, 90% of our work was actually restoring the existing structure. But what people were really interested in is what these apartments feel inside. And what our intention here was to make sure that you felt that you were in Centrepoint and nowhere else. So there's a big spine beam which runs down the centre, which you have to get pipes under, so you've got really low ceiling heights in the middle of the plan. So that's where all the circulation and the serving spaces, the bathrooms and the kitchens. all are. So we deliberately used quite a dark palette there. So that when you broke out into the living spaces, those were flooded with light, so it really accentuated that sense. The floor details, the panelling details were all to do with trying to get that very graphic effect of the outside of the building. We even got down to designing all the ironmongery. So your touch points, your senses are all engaged. And this is the really important thing. You need to, what you want is for the users of these buildings to really own them and be able to talk about them, experience them, without it being all in highfalutin architectural language. When you get to the rooms, you can see by having that clear clear panel there, it means that you've got these fantastic views where you can look down at the city as well as across the city. And but then when you've got the bathrooms and the kitchens, you're back to that very graphic language. The views across, you know, this is actually quite a recent shot, and when we did this originally, the City of London skyline didn't look like this. And every year it's getting better and better and better. But again, you can see the importance of getting that views. It's 2,550, the floor to ceiling height, which is actually for prime residential is quite low. But nobody notices because they got 15 metres of that view. And by bringing that sill right down, people don't do it. So everybody was saying, oh, it can't be done because the ceiling height's rubbish. It can be done, but you just need to sort of twist the story of what this space is about. We created some nice club spaces. We even stuck a swimming pool on the first floor behind the toast rack. If you know the front of Centrepoint, there's a toast rack where you're quite close to the buses, so it wasn't appropriate for residential. Also, the toast rack would block out all your views. Luckily, you had an additional ceiling height here, so we were able to put a 4-foot deep swimming pool there, which is 30 metres long, running along the length, along Charing Cross Road on that side. You know, to the point of which Leanne was talking about, is the cost of carbon in terms of building new. By us retaining, you know, between 70% of the roof structure, 98% of the external structure, and 94% of the floors, we actually used. There's 65% less embodied carbon in this building than if we had knocked it down and built an equivalent building. 65%. That's a massive, massive difference. But actually, most of the punters, most Londoners, you know, they're not interested in those sorts of stats. What they're interested in is that we created that, the work we did on the tower paid for all this public realm. It opened up that end of Oxford Street and created a new London square, which is not far the size of Leicester Square when you do it from building to building, and really changed and gave ownership of St Giles back to the pedestrian away from the car user. And if that's the trend we can do for our cities, get it all back, all the stuff the Deputy Mayor was talking about, is giving this stuff back to the city, giving it back to people, normal people. You don't have to pay to go through it. You know, this is your space. Those guys up there have paid for it. So that's fine by me, and it seems to be fine by them. And I'm going to shut up now, so I'll keep going.
Thanks, Tim. Fascinating. And now if we could welcome Nick from Purcell, please. Just wait for that to load. It should come up.
Thank you, Tim. Really fascinating. So I'm from Purcell, Native Clerk. I look after hotels for the practice, but I also look at commercial buildings more broadly. Tonight I'm going to talk briefly about, when this comes up, about Camden Town Hall, which is a project we've been working on for 8 years and are continuing on in the second phase of works. So a bit about Purcell, if you don't know already. We are employee-owned and purpose-led. I mean, literally existing buildings, listed or not, is what gets us out of bed in the morning. And we look after a vast array of really fascinating buildings across the UK and internationally, in fact. That's just a key phrase about us. It's social. We're really driven by the social purpose of our buildings. Hearts and minds, Camden Town Hall. I mean, this is for us a great deal of our work involves building a broader consensus around conversion and reuse. This is what I've just said earlier. This is about buying into the methods, which is the minds bit, but also is about reminding people why existing buildings, listed or not, are important, and that's the hearts bit, I think. Our built heritage is a stage or a backdrop for shared cultural, political, and emotional experiences. So the building, if you don't know it, it's across the road from St. Pancras, so suffers a little bit by having a really dramatic neighbour, and in fact the 60s annex, which is now the Standard Hotel, is also equally dramatic. But we spent eight years working on this building. It was designed by a local St. Pancras architect called A.J. Thomas, who worked with Edwin Lutyens for nearly 30 years, including on the Cenotaph and other buildings that you will know. Completed in 1937, so interwar, didn't suffer much in the way of bomb damage during the war, unlike St. Pancras across the road. Also built by local builders, so it really is a building of its location. It's a stripped-back Corinthian classicism, including something I didn't notice, having worked in the area for nearly 10 years, vanishing rustication around the windows, which is worth noticing when you go past the next time. So the work we did initially for the council and with Lendlease as contractors was a full refurbishment of the building. We reduced energy demand at source by 60%, and that was through fabric enhancements, through secondary glazing, and through redoing all the services, including installing heat pumps on the roof. The building is BREEAM excellent in use, so already that's a massive improvement on its existing performance. As part of that work, we created 52,000 square feet of commercial space, which we're now working on fitting out for a commercial client, and I'll come to that later. So the story I want to tell tonight is slightly different. This is just a few brief slides. I'll be quite quick, but this is about what buildings do for us and existing buildings, and to paraphrase Leanne, I think it's about let's don't waste culture, because especially public buildings and other buildings are spaces that we use and spaces that we form emotional attachments to. And you know, a space like this, which is the assembly hall in the eastern end of the building, was a normal town hall, but it also it was the setting for a number of major events. Setting a confrontation between Barbara Castle and Oswald Mosley in 1938, just after it opened. It was a food rationing office during the war. It was the setting for a performance of a campaign for nuclear disarmament, a performance called Everybody Sit, featuring Vanessa Redgrave, and also, sorry, I can't read the rest of these notes, and many election accounts, including Glenda Jackson's win majority of 13,000 in 1997. So this kind of space, even though it's just a shell, has carried all these experiences and all these shared experiences by people, and this is critical to retaining these spaces. Space for culture. So it was in 1953. Earlier than that, it was the first ever Caribbean carnival, which later became the Notting Hill Carnival. Took place in this building on the top right. It was the location for the St. Pancras Arts Festival for many decades. And that included painters and writers. It showcased pre-Raphaelite artists who were based in the area, the Euston Road School and Camden Town Group. So a lot of our visual heritage comes from this location as well, and that's part of this building's history. It also was the setting for many concerts. Kirsty MacColl, The Verve pictured here, the Blue Tones, and many others over the years. So all of us went to concerts as when we were younger, and these are the kind of experiences that took place here. Space for connection. I mean, it's a public building. You can still get married there. You could get married there all the way through its existence. And these are some of the people who got married there. Catherine Deneuve and David Bailey, John Hopkins and Susie Zeiger. It was the setting for one of the first, if not the first, equal marriage in London when it was legalised. So these are, intimate, personal moments, but they're milestones. They're things we always remember, right? So you lose the building, you lose these connection to these events as well. So what we're doing now in this 52,000 square feet, which is the assembly hall you see on the bottom left, and 3 levels of the building, which are the basement and the second and third floors, we're fitting out for an Italian events company called Il Bataccio, working with Tom Dixon's design research studio on the interiors. Will be event space, workspace, and conferencing. So a different form of connection, more business focused, but ultimately will have the same level of social engagement as other events in the building. This is being done while the council is in use. So it's a really complex fit-out project because we're having to retool all these spaces to serve much heavier use than they were designed for in terms of services and air changes and the like. AV, IT, lighting, all those kind of things we have to integrate sensitively into the culture, into the listed fabric. But also, while the building is in use by the council. So that's a really complex project. And the first phase is due to complete in July, and the second phase towards the end of the year. And then just more broadly on Purcell's. So we do this in lots of different kinds of buildings. So Boston Manor on the top right was a private manor house, is now a community space. The Mandarin Oriental is a hotel, that's what I do. But it has plenty of public areas where people meet, have lunch, travel, make connections to local communities. That sort of stuff happens every day in these buildings. Battersea Power Station, where we were conservation architect and brick conservation architect, 6 million bricks, I understand. That's another space where people go and spend their leisure time, and form connections to each other and to their context. And I think this is such an important piece that we don't, when we throw away buildings, we lose that connection to experience and culture. And that's it, very brief.
Thank you very much, Nick. Nikhil Scott, everyone. Hello.
I'll just get cracking. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. My name is Nikhil Scott. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor focusing on climate change at Historic England. There we go. So a bit of a brief intro for us, if you haven't come across us before. We're the government's statutory advisor on all matters relating to the historic environment in England, and that covers a very wide range of things, everything from listed buildings to shipwrecks to Stonehenge to Victorian terraced homes, which may or may not need a retrofit project. One of the main things that we do, and is a big part of our vision, is supporting all parties in delivering energy and carbon efficiency improvements to their historic buildings, but also to supporting the adaptation of historic buildings into livable, useful spaces. That's a big part of how we operate. We believe that heritage can survive for longer if it's used effectively, if it's maintained, and it has a purpose if it lives. And so what my focus is in the sort of wild world of climate change policy is it's a challenging space. The Climate Change Act, as Leanne mentioned earlier, it does mandate net zero by 2050. I also don't know what happens if we don't meet that target. But to achieve this net zero, we have to reduce emissions from buildings. And buildings are the second largest source of emissions in the UK, nearly fifth in 2022. And a very meaningful slice of that built environment are historic buildings and listed buildings too. So to give you a sense of scale, about 21% of domestic buildings in England were built before 1919. That's what I mean when I say historic. And about 32% of non-domestic buildings are pre-1919. So a fifth and a third, respectively, are the proportions that we're dealing with. We're a very old country as far as buildings go, which is great. So therefore, net zero can only be achieved in the built environment or just in general in the country if historic and listed buildings are brought along on the journey. If we don't bring them along, net zero is almost impossible, effectively. So, with that in mind, what can we do to challenge perceptions, what this event's about, to change hearts and minds about building and ownership types to prioritise retrofit over more wasteful alternatives? Because the good news that I'm very happy to share is that it definitely can be done. If you've not had a chance to wander through the exhibition upstairs, I do highly recommend it. In nearly every pod that you'll go through for all the themes, there is an example of a historic building, a listed building, a case where the materials have been respected, the original architecture restored. It absolutely can be done, but often the problem that I and many people who work with me come up against is the misconception that it can't be done, that these buildings are too old, they're too weird, they're too complex. The phrase is often too complex to decarbonise. You'll sometimes see that in government documents. How can we challenge that? And what I've done is I've brought a sort of list of solutions, which hopefully I'll be able to rattle through, and so we can get on to the Q&A. Some of the things that I do day to day and that we can all do to challenge that misconception that historic buildings can't be retrofitted, because they can be and they have to be. So what can we do? So we can share the possibilities, the fact that it can be done. So Historic England shares lots of different advice free and available online. So we produced an advice note last year, the Historic England Advice Note 18, which gives out various ways in which historic buildings can be retrofitted. So solar panels, heat pumps, all the fun stuff. And it also gives details about how the planning system can be negotiated, often a bit of a scary beast. But what I think is perhaps one of the most interesting or useful parts of HEAN 18 is that it tells you about the whole building approach, which is the methodology for retrofitting that we sort of swear by, that we think is the best one for retrofitting any building, because it takes a sort of 360-degree approach. It looks at how a building is used, its context, its location, its materials, its history, everything, to find the best menu of options for any given building, because the best solution for your building is not going to be the best for your neighbours down the street, because they might have an entirely different context and entirely different usage. By approaching buildings in this way, we can find the best solutions for any building and how to preserve them and use them. So HEAN 18 shows how retrofit, not if it can be done, but how it should be done and must be done. And we have lots of similar free advice online for you to peruse at your leisure. What else can we do? So acting on cutting-edge research. So Leanne alluded to this earlier, so you've been in suspense for about half an hour now. So a few months ago, we published research on new homes from vacant historic buildings. I love this fact. I shove it in every bit of work I possibly can. If you were to repair, renovate, retrofit vacant historic buildings in England, buildings at the moment are sitting idle doing nothing, you could provide upwards of 500,000 new homes of varying sizes. You can see the details there on the graphic. That's an enormous amount of homes, but it's important to not look at that number and think, oh, that's great, I'm so glad I know that, but to do something with it, to take it to decision makers and to say, wow, this is very timely. The government wants to produce 1.5 million new homes. That's great, but why can't a third of them be retrofitted historic properties? That's a far more environmentally friendly course of action. It will produce far less embodied carbon to retrofit and renovate historic properties and to build new ones. But Historic England also has bits of research which indicate that people just like that kind of building more. They like a home with a bit of character, a bit of history, a bit of flavour, rather than something which feels a bit more mass-produced and less character. It's important to produce really interesting nuggets of research like this, and groups like the National Retrofit Hub, of course, do that. But we have to do something with it. We have to act on that research and take it to the people in power who can make things happen. Because I feel like you'd like it. What else can and should we do? Myth busting. It's very important wherever possible to myth bust misconceptions and replace them with positive truths. So a lot of myths and misconceptions out there about heat pumps, and we tackled that recently when we held these webinars online in our sort of catchily named Technical Tuesday webinars. I'd highly recommend if you find yourself free on a Tuesday. They're a lot of fun. So we held 2 of them about addressing myths and misconceptions, going into the history of these units and how a lot of what we're told, a lot of what we often hear in the media is just simply not true. There's issues around sort of noise and expense, all those sorts of things. There was such popularity and demand that we had to hold a second session. There was something like over 1,000 people that attended between the 2 sessions. So it's really important to challenge those negative issues when we encounter them, when it's something as important as climate change, but also to replace them with something productive and positive. Something which I'm sure I don't need to sell in the building centre, where again, if you go up to the exhibition, there's heaps of best practice, but it's really helpful when you're trying to change hearts and minds to show examples of where it can be done, where the proof is in the pudding. And there's a million great examples out there, but one that I absolutely love, I've used it in a few presentations now, is a property down in Dorset. Down? I don't know where Dorset is relative to London. Called Athelhampton House, which is a Grade 1 listed Tudor mansion. Before their big project, they had very high bills, something like £100,000 of energy bills a year and about 100 tonnes of carbon, which is quite a lot. After their project, their energy bills are nothing. They have no bills now, and their emissions are also nothing. I think the only emissions that come from this site are the emissions that come from the tractor. I don't think you can retrofit a tractor. But that's an amazing success, and who would have thought that you could do that to a property that's hundreds of years old? And their project was also done sensitively and was able to restore and improve the historic fabric in that. I'm told it's quite cosy. I'd love to visit. I haven't been yet. But it's a great example of the kind of building which one person might choose to write off as too complex to decarbonise, but they put the time and effort in and they really reaped the rewards. And now they have a zero carbon Tudor mansion, so do visit if you're in Dorset. And the last thing, it was touched on a bit at the start, but I think it's important to underline just how important storytelling is. I think climate communicators and stripes are coming to realise the lost time that's come in sort of previous decades when it comes to trying to communicate the climate crisis in a way that's too scary, or abstract, or focuses too much on numbers. What people really connect with is stories. And there's a lot of work that we can do to share positive stories. So to give you an example, Historic England recently published a video, it's called something to the effect of how this Victorian home's got zero energy bills. It's a terraced home in Walthamstow in East London. And they underwent a project and they installed solar panels and heat pumps, and now they also have no bills, which is great. But watching the video, it's not just the kind of journey that was impactful. There were lots of little moments in that overall journey that really stuck with me. So there's one which I really enjoyed where the presenter, she's standing outside in the garden and the heat pump is next to her, and she says, it's 3 degrees right now, so it's really cold. This heat pump is working, it's running, it's keeping the house in there cozy, but I can't hear it. Like, it's barely audible, I can't really hear anything. That to me was such a powerful moment of showing, well, again, the proof's kind of in the pudding here. There's a misconception, heat pumps are too noisy, but she's standing next to one, she can't hear it. And I thought that was very powerful. It's that kind of story that can be really valuable when you're trying to change hearts and minds. So yeah, those are my 5 solutions. I think it's a complex problem, but if you do all these different things, if you come at it from different angles, if you take important research to decision makers, but you also tell positive stories, if you platform best practice, if you do all those different things, I really do believe you can pull in a positive direction. That's what we are all about at Historic England. And I was just over 10 minutes, so I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thank you to all our panellists. Can I just invite you all to, whilst Laura is sorting the chairs out, join the stage as we commence our Q&A. Thank you very much, each and every one of our panellists offering a rich and varied story of their take on hearts and minds within the retrofit sector and all the great work they're doing. Opportunity now to offer this over to the floor. Have we got more IT issues? I don't know. I'll try and ignore those. But any questions to start off with? I have one, but I'm willing to let my one be usurped by the floor, hopefully. So who's brave enough to start? Gentleman at the front, thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. Just a quick question. Slides going to be available after the show?
We've recorded,
cool.
Yeah.
Great, that's good. That's not my question, that's right. My name is Marcos. I'm the Director of Policy and Place at the Fitzrovia Partnership, which Mete mentioned at the beginning, as the kind of facilitator of the local area. Leanne, you got Heels, one of your presentations was one of our buildings. And Tim, I used to work at the previous bid in Holborn and Covent and Farringdon, which is the Centrepoint building. So a lot of my old buildings and current ones. Well, my question is, I guess, to all of you, obviously there is a business case oftentimes to make with these. One of the feedback we get from estate agents is that actually employers want to have outstanding BREEAM, Class A, all of the really, really high spec, because that's what the market is wanting in terms of occupiers. How do we tell a better story about those buildings that might not be at that high level of sustainability or efficiency as still being valuable in order to be used by these kind of state-of-the-art occupiers that might want to attract that talent that are asking for that? How do we tell a better story?
I think you have to tell the wider story, because it's not just about the usage in energy, it's about the embodied energy. And as you can see, projects that we've all been discussing, actually the longer story is the important thing. And there's no good building brand new, highly efficient buildings if actually the carbon cost for building those buildings outweighs the building it's replaced. And I think we just have to be much clearer about that. And when we work with sales agents, often we're helping them create the script.
and they're usually very open to it. They want to know what the narrative, what the story is.
Just on, so I think feedback about sales agents is sometimes they're not always as forward-thinking as we would like them to be. And there's a lot of, not excuses, but sort of they're used to doing things a certain way. So that's often a barrier. It's rarely the barrier actually from the end user. So first of all, most of the buildings that we're featuring have been brought up to standard. And the Heels building is a really good example. And I can't remember the tenant, but I know it's really cool and funky. And Richard might... Clockwise, yes. Clockwise, yes. So what we're finding is a lot of end users are coming in, and their young staff love these buildings because they're cool. And another example is the Taifu Tea Factory in Birmingham. So the Taifu Tea Factory had been derelict for something like 40 years. And I think that the agents were very, very sceptical about reuse. But the BBC came along and said, this is exactly what we want. And so suddenly the agents, I think when you're standing in front of a client who wants to pay, they change their mind.
I think personality of buildings does sell, big time. We do quite a lot of workplace stuff, and that market's changed completely now, and people want the personality. They want it to be better than their home.
Just on hotels that I specialise in, people want authenticity, they want connection to place. You can do that in new buildings, it's much harder. But when you've got a story that you can build on and you can develop, I think that's much easier to achieve.
Yeah, I think it's about creating value in things which aren't typically valued, certainly maybe not in a financial sense. Like I think it's certainly in historic England we'll consider sort of social value, community value, well-being value, and certainly there's so much of that to gain from reuse and retrofit, which needs to be valued in its own right. And you can also just see that from a climate change perspective. I was talking to someone recently from Don't Waste Buildings actually, who was talking about these pyramids that you sometimes see of building materials and how they're ranked by their global warming potential. And she said we need to have one of those where, like, at zero is an existing building because its carbon's been emitted maybe 100 years ago, and that should have value in and of itself. So it's about changing perspectives, I think.
Perfect. Thank you. Anyone else? Ooh, Rachel.
Thanks all, excellent presentations. I'm thinking a bit about what Mete said at the start about the sort of public backlash towards net zero and the polarisation that's happening in that space, and the sort of politicisation of an issue that I think most of us in the room don't think should be politicised. And I wonder if you think there's an opportunity for historic buildings to sort of act as that bridge between the climate crisis and what people really want to see. I'm kind of reminded of a few years ago when Hurst Castle sort of half fell into the sea, and it was this really clear moment where it showed that historic buildings were at risk of the climate crisis. And considering that generally members of the public love historic buildings, do you think that there's an opportunity there to use the way that we work with historic buildings to can make that reconnection with the climate crisis in people's minds? Do you think there's like a, I don't know, can historic buildings kind of lead that sort of mindset shift?
I think absolutely. I think it's really low-hanging fruit because across the political range, it's quite difficult to find people who don't like old buildings. And if you can frame it in such a way that, almost the climate change is incidental, that actually we're doing all these things to make these buildings last and have another 150 years or whatever. It's actually what we did on the Centrepoint, because at the time it wasn't all about climate change, but it was about us trying to lengthen the life of something and its contribution. I think that's a much easier door to push open, actually.
If I can just make a comment on that. I think that, and not being critical of Historic England or any of the heritage groups, but I think most people in this country already get they love historic buildings. And when we talk about don't waste buildings, people always think of historic. Now, I think that's good and bad because there is a perception amongst the public that it's too difficult to retrofit old buildings, that there are too many blockers and policies and it's too hard. And so I was with someone the other day and she was talking about she owns a grade 2 listed home and she was like, never again, it's all too hard. And so there is definitely that we have to address. And I think some of the heritage organisations need to go a long way in showing that they're adapting as well. But I think also for us at Don't Waste Buildings, we're all about the ugly. The journeyman buildings or journeywoman buildings that are not, there is no one campaigning for. And again, we've been to some really boring sort of 80s office buildings that have had fantastic retrofit and brought back to life and saved the carbon and also brought back into use more quickly, which is very important. So all about the unloved.
Bristol was born out one of those moments after the Second World War when buildings were damaged, falling down, and there was material shortages, there were food shortages, housing shortages. Saving historic buildings really wasn't on top of anybody's agenda, and we were born out of that moment, and we carry on the work to this day. And I think we're in a place now where there's a similar emergency, and we all feel it, we all see it, and I think it's about connecting those dots and making sure people understand these things are connected ultimately.
I think that one of the most challenging parts about working in any dimension of climate action is the frustration, because the benefits of doing it are always so multiple and varied. And so absolutely, I think you said it best, it is very low-hanging fruits. Like people could easily rally around an idea of preserving buildings. You have a sort of image in your mind almost of what a wonderful group of people you'd bring together from communities that probably would never talk to each other, but actually all agree that they all like old buildings. So it definitely is something that could and should be drawn upon. As often in the case of climate stuff, it feels really obvious, but it's still worth telling people.
I think that hard to treat concept is another label that exists. Actually, that can sometimes become a problem, but the point is it's a language and it's education and it's getting behind that to demonstrate that hard to treat doesn't mean you can't treat, and that's part of the process and the explanation to demonstrate that there are case studies to prove that this can be delivered at scale.
If I can just add one more point to Leanne's thing about post-war heritage. I mean, we unfortunately have an age where buildings that I grew up with are now starting to be historic and listed, brutalist, modernist structures. And we do focus on those kind of buildings as well. So there's a growing movement to look at that kind of heritage as well and keep it in use and protect it.
Absolutely.
I would also add that it's not very easy to get planning permission for new buildings either. We do a lot of housing regeneration work with large social housing estates and try and revive them. And we've got one very important central London scheme which is still being considered 14 months after we put the application in. So there's a fundamental thing here in defence of the historic bodies. Frankly, I find them the least of the problems. It is a much bigger problem than that, which needs to be addressed. Now, the Labour government are saying they're going to address it, but they need to move pretty fast because every month goes past, this is going backwards.
I think that's an important point, though, in terms of hearts and minds of people, is that there are so many blockers to every part of our lives. I mean, we're all, everything seems to be difficult. And so I think that there is a huge move to try and paint net zero as another blocker. So you just add another layer. And that's why people are feeling, and you can't blame them because it's a bit overwhelming for people at the moment. And so we have to show, and that's where the policy and everything else we've been talking about is so important, because if we can show them that it's easier, that it's clearer, that they know what the rules are. That is a really important point to bring people along, and then they can just get on with it. I mean, I think Keir Starmer said at the beginning of his term, he wants to sort of look after things and then get out of the way of people, and that's essentially what we're asking as well. Give clarity, give some incentives. I want to talk about, sorry, very quickly, I didn't mention VAT and language around that. So we've been talking about abolishing VAT on retrofit, and someone said to me today we should be saying it's harmonising VAT with how it is for new builds, and I like that. I think that's a much gentler way of saying that. So if you can take that back to Treasury, that would be great.
Got time for one more question. Lady at the front.
Hi, thank you. There's a couple of things actually about the blockers I thought was interesting, and I think changing that, there's the whole culture of fear of failure, and I'm a past vice chair of planning, and I did a talk for Purcell actually back in March, and I spoke about the Egyptian halls in Glasgow, and I believe in 1991 Glasgow Council were going to serve a CPO, and it's only this year it's actually been served. So there's 34 lost years of... So I'm just wondering what the blockers were. Is it that fear of failure or just lack of passion, what have you? And the other thing I just wanted to point out was I really liked what Nikhil said about the, in the storytelling where the lady was describing how quiet the heat pump was. And I think in a lot of stories, in a lot of businesses, numbers play like that really high thing, and we forget about the public's, just the feelings and the experience and what have you. So maybe earlier on in the process, the public could actually be brought in to say their experiences and connections. That was it really, it was just a thought. But what do you think about the fear of the failure I was talking about?
I think that is spot on. I think a lot of people, that's why we behave in this, the way we know. It's the way housing has been developed, you know, with the housing estates, because that's what they know not works, but that it delivers numbers. So I think that's a really important factor. And having, but we can't rely just on bravery and courage alone from people. We've got to give them some support so they can at least cover their costs and not make a loss on it. But I think that's a really important point. And as you say, 34 years, lost year, that's generations, 2 generations.
Before, earlier on we were talking about, you and I were talking about early engagement. And I think, in my experience, the earlier we can engage with the users and get the users to own it, that's how you unlock it. The reason why I have such a blockage in planning is because it's a defensive thing. You know, it's about objectors, not about owners, if you see what I mean. And I think that goes across the board, whether we're dealing with old buildings or otherwise. And actually it goes back to the point, I think people will generally feel more comfortable with owning something they can already see if you can communicate it well enough to see where this is what the potential is. And a lot of the brutalist buildings, which as architects we all really love, you know, the problem is people don't love them yet. People didn't used to love Centrepoint, not a brutalist building, keep saying. But the task for us in particular is to give that ownership. So we're not talking to other architects who all agree with us. You know, it's about who we're doing it for.
I'm sorry, I've got the mic. So, yeah, I think it's just about, it's a really important point about fear of failure, and I think it's about how intimidating this process can seem. And you think that, I think Mete made the point that, you know, we feel like we're just one part of a small machine and we can't really have that much influence. But I think all of us live in areas of our cities where we see buildings that could be reused. I do a lot of early work with investors, looking at opportunities in buildings and trying to identify the kind of, you know, what the possibility of this place is ultimately. And that's often before any design work takes place, before any planning work takes place. It's really about getting people to buy into the opportunity, and I think we can all do that. You know, we can all take advantage of that opportunity, and these sort of forums are ideal for that.
I think fear of the unknown is an interesting one, and on some level it's just fear of failure, but perhaps it is just a fear of the unknown. I think that retrofit is just such a complicated beast, and there's a lot of different the answer to the name of this exhibition, Retrofit 25, What's Stopping Us? There's a lot of answers, right? And something that Historic England's been saying more and more in recent months and years is that something that will answer that fear of the unknown and perhaps tackle that fear of failure is just that we need a bit more leadership, a bit more certainty from government. Something that's been in a couple of consultation responses we've done recently is a call for government to produce something like a national retrofit strategy, something that addresses all the different parts of this problem that we as individuals, can't comprehend or tackle on our own. Something that considers the planning system, that considers shortages of staff in local authority, the people who actually approve the planning applications, considering skills and funding and training and everything. And I think tackling it like that will ultimately, hopefully, help with fear of failure, because it is a problem.
Thank you. Very impactful point to end on. So I am afraid that I have to draw the evening to a close. The building centre does close at 8 o'clock, but we do have time to go and see the exhibition, network, ask some questions to the panellists. But before I do leave, can we join hands and applaud each and every one of you for your time? Thank you. Thank you very much.